A soldier is on his knees in the fog, and he cannot see the man who just shot him. He fires back anyway, into grey, into nothing, and somewhere in that same nothing, another American in the same uniform goes down, hit by a bullet meant for an enemy that was never actually there. This is not a reenactment. This is what the official record itself struggles to explain about the morning of January 17th, 1873, in a stretch of frozen lava rock in northern California, where an army outnumbering its enemy more than 10-1 could not tell where its own line ended and the enemy's began. Here is the part that never quite adds up. Fewer than 60 men held that ground. Not for an hour, not for a single skirmish. For months, against a force that would eventually top 1,000 soldiers. And when it was finally over, the official casualty count on one side sat at 0, not low, 0. You already know Little Bighorn. Custer, the hill, the last stand told and retold until it became a kind of scripture. But Little Bighorn, brutal as it was at least a fight, both sides expected to lose or win outright, decided in an afternoon. What happened at the lava beds was slower, stranger, and far harder for Washington to explain, which may be exactly why so few people have ever heard of it. So we're going to do something different with this one. We're not just going to tell you what happened. We're going to look at what the record actually says happened, where it contradicts itself, and where a version of events was allowed to calcify into history long before anyone checked whether it was true. Because at least one of the key accounts from this war, the one everyone still repeats, may not be reliable at all. We'll get to that. There's a second problem buried in this story, and it's easy to miss on a first pass. Two governments produced two very different paper trails about the same 11 months. The Army's official reports describe a campaign with orderly phases and defensible decisions. The surviving Modoc testimony, recorded later, filtered through interpreters who weren't always neutral, describes something closer to a slow-motion collapse forced on a starving community. Both documents exist. They don't agree, and for more than a century, only one of them got taught. Start with what both sides agreed on. In the closing weeks of 1872, a band of Modoc people, led by a man the American settlers called Captain Jack, left the reservation they'd been forced onto and returned to the land along Lost River their families had lived on for generations. Fewer than 200 people. No arms build-up, no raiding, no declaration of anything. Just a return home. The army was ordered to bring them back by force. When soldiers moved to disarm the Modoc camp at dawn, shooting broke out, and accounts differ, even now, on exactly who fired the first round. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The Modoc didn't retreat toward the hills, where cavalry could run them down in open country. They moved into the lava fields south of Tule Lake and effectively disappeared. That first disputed shot matters more than it looks. Army reports from the time describe an orderly disarmament interrupted by resistance. Later Modoc testimony describes a camp startled awake by armed men at dawn, reacting to what looked, from the inside, like an attack rather than a routine order. Both can't be fully true at once, and the difference isn't academic. It decides whether this war began with defiance or with panic, and history has generally been far more comfortable with the first version. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what that ground actually is. It isn't hills or forest. It's the hardened skin of an ancient eruption, split by trenches deep enough to swallow a man standing upright, honeycombed with caves that carry sound in directions that make no sense. Soldiers who fought there later described losing all sense of where gunfire was coming from. The rock threw echoes sideways, backward, in circles. Boots that could handle a mountain trail were shredded to ribbons within a day on that glass-sharp stone. There's a reason the Army's own maps of the area, drawn before the war began, are so thin on detail. Nobody in command had ever needed to know this ground intimately. The Modoc had lived on it, hunted it, buried people in it, for longer than anyone could say. That asymmetry, one side treating the terrain as an obstacle, the other side treating it as an extension of their own memory, decided far more of this war than rifles ever did. The Modoc had grown up on this land. The army had a map that was in places simply wrong. On the morning of the first battle of the stronghold, a column of American troops advanced through fog, thick enough to erase a man 5 feet away. What followed, according to the soldiers who survived it, was not really a battle against the Modoc at all. It was an army fighting its own confusion, squads firing at movement that turned out to be each other, officers unable to coordinate a line they couldn't see, casualties mounting from friendly fire in numbers nobody wanted written down clearly. When the fog lifted and the army withdrew, the numbers were almost impossible to justify to anyone back east. Dozens of American casualties. A Modoc force of roughly 50 fighters, and by most tellings, not one of them killed. The reports from that battle were quietly classified, worded carefully. For decades, the full scale of what happened that morning simply wasn't public. That alone should tell you something about how the people in charge felt about what their own men had just written down. It also wasn't the last time this pattern repeated. Over the following weeks, smaller engagements played out across the same broken ground, and the outcome kept rhyming with the first one. A patrol would push forward, confident, sometimes careless, and the rock would seem to answer from every direction at once, before the men who fired ever showed themselves. By February, some officers were privately describing the terrain itself as the real enemy, more dangerous to morale than the Modoc fighters were. That's not a detail that made it into the recruitment posters. But here's the detail that most retellings skip entirely, and it's the one that starts to unravel the tidy version of this story. The Modoc weren't just holding a position. They were running out of everything a person needs to survive a siege: food, dry wood, ammunition, and above all, time. Winning every engagement doesn't matter much if you're starving while you do it. That single fact is the hinge this entire war turns on, and almost nobody tells it that way. Because if the Modoc were winning militarily but losing physically, then the question isn't why the war eventually turned. The question is why it turned exactly when it did, and that's where the record gets genuinely murky. By late March, the picture inside the stronghold had changed in ways the army couldn't see from outside it. Dwindling firewood in freezing nights, water sources that had to be reached under risk of exposure, children and elders weakening faster than fighters. None of that shows up in a casualty count, because none of it was a battle, but it was killing people just as surely, and it was doing something to group cohesion that months of shelling hadn't managed to do. The most widely repeated version of what happened next goes like this. Captain Jack, a man most accounts agree preferred a negotiated peace, was pressured by more radical members of his own camp into assassinating the American general leading the peace talks. The story includes a detail almost every documentary repeats, without hesitation, that his own men placed a woman's shawl or hat on his head in front of the camp, calling him a coward, daring him to prove otherwise. It's a vivid detail. It's also one historians have never been able to fully verify. It comes down to us second-hand, filtered through translators, through later interviews, through people with their own reasons to shape the story a certain way. That doesn't make it false. But treating it as settled fact, the way most retellings do, is exactly the kind of shortcut that turns a messy historical moment into a clean legend. Ask yourself why that particular detail survived so well when so much else about this war didn't. A single humiliating gesture, a single clear villain moment, gives a documentary something tidy to build toward. A slow collapse caused by cold, hunger, and an impossible siege gives you nothing to point a camera at. That doesn't mean the shawl story is invented. It means we should be honest about how much weight it's being asked to carry. What we can say with more confidence is this. Pressure inside the Modoc camp was real. The siege conditions were brutal enough to fracture unity that had held for months. And by early April 1873, Captain Jack had shifted from resisting the idea of violence at the peace talks to reluctantly agreeing to it. Whatever the exact mechanism of that shift, the outcome is not in dispute. And so on April 11th, Good Friday, a peace commission led by General Edward Canby met with Modoc representatives under a flag of truce. Canby, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely believed a settlement was within reach. He had no reason to expect the meeting to be anything other than what it was supposed to be. Captain Jack came to that meeting carrying a concealed pistol, but one report changed the entire picture. A handful of accounts, pieced together well after the fact, suggest the decision to kill Canby wasn't finalized in that tent at all. It may have already been settled days earlier, inside the camp, once Jack's authority had effectively broken under the weight of hunger and humiliation. If true, the meeting itself was never really a negotiation. It was a formality, walking toward an outcome already decided. At a signal, he drew it, pressed it to Canby's face, and fired. In the chaos that followed, a second commissioner was killed and others wounded, the peace tent collapsing into gunfire and panic on ground that, minutes earlier, had been treated as neutral by both sides. General Edward Canby remains, to this day, the only general officer in United States Army history killed during peace negotiations with Native Americans. Not in a firefight, not in an ambush, at a table under a truce by the man leading the opposite side of the talks. For a country that had, only weeks earlier, treated this entire conflict as a minor policing matter unworthy of much attention, the news landed like a diplomatic earthquake. Newspapers that had barely mentioned the Modoc suddenly ran the story on their front pages. The word used again and again, in letter after letter from officers and officials, was betrayal, as though the idea of an indigenous leader breaking a truce was somehow less imaginable than the years of broken treaties that had led to that tent in the first place. Here is where most versions of this story rush forward into the manhunt, the vengeance, the ending. But there's a detail buried in the timeline that changes how you should read everything that came before it. If that reading holds up, then the story usually told, a lone leader forced into treachery by a single dramatic taunt, is too simple. The real story is slower, colder, and in some ways more damning. A community pushed past its breaking point by a siege it was winning tactically and losing physically, until the distinction between resistance and self-destruction stopped meaning anything. Whichever version you find more convincing, what happened after is not in dispute at all. News of Canby's death reached telegraph lines within hours, and the national mood shifted from irritation to outright fury. Whatever restraint had shaped the army's approach up to that point disappeared. This stopped being a campaign to herd a few hundred people back onto a reservation. It became a manhunt, with reinforcements, heavy artillery, and an unspoken understanding that this would end in punishment, not negotiation. The siege ground on, shelling that the lava rock mostly absorbed, patrols that kept finding nothing, and slowly, the same starvation that had pressured Captain Jack into violence began pulling his own camp apart from the inside. Some of his men, desperate for any chance at leniency, eventually helped army trackers locate him. He was captured in June 1873, hiding in a shallow cave with a handful of remaining followers, with nothing left to fight the outcome with. The trial that followed was conducted by a military commission, not a civilian court, but the very institution whose General Jack had killed, now deciding whether he would live. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take long. On October 3, 1873, Captain Jack and 3 others were hanged at Fort Klamath. For most historical figures, that would be the end of the record. It wasn't the end of his. After the hanging, Captain Jack's body was decapitated. His head was preserved, shipped across the country, and delivered to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., where it was catalogued and displayed, not as the remains of a man who had just outmaneuvered a professional army for months, but as a specimen filed under the era's grim habit of studying indigenous remains as objects of racial science. Read that back. A man capable of holding a fortress against odds of more than 10 to 1 was, in death, reduced by his own government to an exhibit on a shelf. There's no ambiguity in this part of the record. The transfer was documented. The cataloguing was documented. It sat in that collection for years before eventually being returned, decades later, to descendants who had spent generations asking for exactly that. Unlike the shawl story, unlike the exact words spoken inside a starving camp in April 1873, this part of the investigations doesn't rest on interpretation. It rests on a paper trail nobody ever bothered to hide, because at the time, nobody in charge saw any reason to. Meanwhile, the Modoc who survived, including people who had never fired a shot in the entire war, were exiled more than 2,000 miles from that land to Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma, stripped from the one piece of ground that had ever actually protected them. So here's where the investigation lands. Why does almost nobody know this war existed, while Little Bighorn gets a battlefield, a monument, and a permanent chapter in the national story? The most convincing explanation isn't that the Modoc War was less significant. By several measures, the casualty ratio, the length of the siege, the assassination of a sitting general during a truce, it was more extraordinary. The more convincing explanation is that Little Bighorn, despite being an American defeat, still fit a story the country wanted to tell about itself. Brave men, overwhelmed but unbroken, fighting to the last round. The Modoc War fit no flattering story at all. It was a defeat born from bureaucratic cruelty, followed by a battlefield humiliation the army tried to bury in its own paperwork, followed by an assassination that shattered the last available narrative of honorable conduct on either side, followed by a punishment so undignified it stripped a defeated leader of even his remains. There was no clean myth to extract from that, so it was left out. Consider, too, how differently each war treated its own dead. Custer's men were memorialized, their names carved into stone, their positions on the battlefield mapped and preserved as a monument any visitor can walk today. Captain Jack's remains were catalogued as a specimen and left in storage for decades. One story got a shrine, the other got a shelf. That contrast alone tells you almost everything about which defeats a nation chooses to honor and which ones it prefers to file away. It's worth asking, too, what happened to the physical evidence of the war itself. The stronghold is still there, largely unchanged, preserved today as part of a national monument. Trenches, caves, and all. Unlike a battlefield that gets paved over or built on, this one survived almost entirely intact, which means the terrain that confused an entire army in 1873 can still be walked by anyone willing to make the trip. And yet, for most of the last century, almost nobody did. What we can say with confidence: the outnumbering, the fog, the classified reports, the assassination, the decapitation, all of that is documented, cross-referenced, and settled. What remains genuinely uncertain is the exact human mechanism behind Captain Jack's final decision. Whether it was one dramatic act of humiliation in front of his camp, or a slower collapse of authority under conditions no leader could have survived intact. There's also the matter of numbers, and how confidently they get repeated. Most accounts settle on roughly 50 Modoc fighters and a peak US force above 1,000. But contemporary tallies shift depending on who was counting, when, and for what purpose. A commanding officer requesting reinforcements has every incentive to inflate the size of the threat he's facing. The general shape of the imbalance isn't in question. The precise figures, dressed up as exact in so many retellings, deserve more skepticism than they usually get. You've now seen both versions laid side by side. One is more cinematic, a single humiliating moment, a clear villain, a clean turning point you can point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. The other is more consistent with what starvation, isolation, and months of impossible pressure actually do to people and to leadership. A slow erosion with no single moment you can freeze and blame. Which one do you find more convincing? And does it change how you see everything that came before it? That question matters beyond this one war. Every buried piece of history got buried by a choice, made by someone, for a reason. Sometimes that reason is simple embarrassment. Sometimes it's something closer to shame. The Modoc War carries both. And the fact that it took this long for the full shape of it to resurface should make you wonder, honestly, what else from this same era is still sitting in an archive somewhere, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Somewhere between the army's clean version and the Modoc's harder one sits the actual truth. And it probably isn't fully recoverable now, not with the people who lived it long gone, and the paperwork written by the side, with every reason to soften its own record. That's not a failure of this investigation. It's just what's left when a government decides at the time that a story doesn't need to be preserved carefully. That's the case as the record currently allows us to reconstruct it. The verdict on the smaller details is still open. Weigh it yourself.